friends, and educators. Welcome back to another episode of The Informed Educator. We're your hosts, Lauren and Ann. Today, we welcome Chris Sarkonak. Chris is a grade 9 to 12 physics teacher at Crocus Plains Regional Secondary School in Brandon. He is a regional coordinator in Manitoba for the Perimeter Institute Teacher Network and a passionate advocate for STEM. Mr. Sarkonak is the teacher supervisor for his school's STEM club, featuring a STEM for Girls Week and a Student at Reach program aimed at K-8 students across the city. And he also oversees the Astronomy Club and students on the Beamline Club. He is a recipient of the Canadian Association of Physicists Award for Excellence in High School Physics Teaching for the Prairies region and has twice received the ceremonial Star Blanket from Indigenous students at grad. Today, we will be talking to him about his innovative approaches to assessment in his physics classes, as well as his work with the Perimeter Institute on climate change education. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
So to get us started, can you walk us through what your gradeless portfolio-based assessment model looks like in practice?
Yeah. So I guess early in my career, I went ahead and I wasn't happy with how assessment was being reflected in my classroom. I tried some different things. I tried, standards-based grading. I tried gamification, a couple things like that over the years, and then, but just the workload involved, it didn't feel sustainable. Standards-based grading and teaching math or sciences, it was always an endless stream of reassessments and remarking, and often just felt like I was drowning in it. So I went ahead and I quite often would step back from it, go back to very traditional, and then COVID was kind of the tipping point for me. And so I think it was for a lot of educators at the time. And I didn't want to just take my tests and put them into, say, forms and have kids do them from home. Um, my thought was, okay, there's still physics all around you, even at home. So let's see what we can play around with and see what we can do. So, hopefully, despite the circumstances, physics is still something that kids look forward to, right? But that meant that I had to re-gear my assessment practices as well. And so I started doing interviews with kids. And I very quickly realized that, there was a student who had like a 90 or so in my class and going into COVID, and had this interview with him and started to realize that he really hadn't picked up much of what I had taught so far in the first couple months. And, there was no real connection to the physics or understanding of it. And, it kind of didn't sit right with me that he was sitting at a 90 in the course. And then there was another student that I interviewed who had about a 60, and the student was producing absolutely brilliant work because they had the time for it. And so they loved graphic design. And so they were integrating physics with their graphic design and just producing incredibly thoughtful stuff. And, they could talk to me about physics. They were excited to talk to me about the physics. And so I asked them, how do you only have a 60 in my class so far? And he said, well, when I walk into a test, I get anxious and then I can't remember anything. And so I don't test well. And he just resigned himself to that fact after, 12 years of school. And it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks that the wrong kids were getting the grades. And, if you could have somebody who couldn't see the very basics was getting the ultra high grades because they could memorize well, and the students who didn't memorize well but were very insightful and when they took the time to think things through did phenomenal work, it wasn't right. And so that gave me kind of the courage, and when we came back off of COVID, to just tear everything down. and I just figured, okay, well, I can't really go much further wrong than what's going on right now. And so I started talking to my students in those first groups back and saying, okay, well, what should matter? And so we started off looking at the curriculum, and we looked at, like in Manitoba, we have these cluster zero skills or global competencies that have been in our science curriculum for a couple decades now. And then we've got our content outcomes. So I put them up on the board side by side. Okay, what's more important to your lives? Okay, the kids all went ahead and unanimously said, well, these cluster zero pieces, like learning how to be a problem solver, learning how to think critically, those are the things that will last the rest of their lives, not whether they memorize force is mass times acceleration. A couple kids might need that for a little while, but even in university physics, that disappears, and is replaced by a better calculus method rather than an algebraic approximation. So it's really about what students do with that was important. And so that started to shape, okay, well, if we're going to focus on the skills, then how are we going to assess them? How are we going to make that the thing that we value? And so we started to look at portfolios and giving students the opportunity to make mistakes early on. I started to tell kids, if you can walk into my classroom and get 100% on the very first thing I give you, then am I really challenging you enough? If this is your very first experience with physics, you should be terrible at it. And we should have a system that builds you up and allows you to be successful, right? It should be challenging. It should be engaging, but it should also push you. Nobody should be good at it the very first time that they do it. And so I wanted to have a system that built them up, but didn't punish them for early mistakes. And so that's where we started talking portfolios and looking at the holistic student and that body of work. And so then I said to the students, okay, well, all right, we'll do portfolios and we'll do these conferences. And I said, I can kind of, as a teacher, I only have to go ahead and provide a grade at midterm and final reports. So I can kind of create a shelter, almost like a risk-free zone during those other pieces of the course. And we can discuss where you're at those times, and it's just a snapshot of where you're at, and it's not average in any way or anything like that. And so then we started talking about, okay, well, what should a 50 to a 60 look like? What should a 60 to a 70 look like? And so on. And students came up with those criteria. And I added in some pieces around self-assessment and how to reflect and metacognitive pieces, and just to kind of keep them on track and keep them focused on growth, and that they shouldn't be, we got 18 weeks in a course, so why are you trying to fix everything from week 2 to week 3 all at once when you can focus on one thing at a time, and we got time for it, and then you'll be more successful in long term. And so we started to build an entire program around all this. So
There are some powerful things that you just said. I'm just thinking of the moments when you were starting to realize, perhaps during the pandemic, oh my gosh, our assessment is not accurately reflecting what students know.
yeah.
Because that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
We talk about assessment a fair bit in our pre-service teacher education, and we think about it constantly throughout our careers. And if it's not actually representative of what students know, and if it's not helping them in their learning, then what are we doing? So that's kind of that must have been a watershed moment for you.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? Like the thing was, my background is math and computer science and physics and all these like really highly logical type fields, right? It's all about like thinking your way through stuff, and this huge problem solving aspect. And often, numbers, as soon as you deal with them, are seen as almost like sacrosanct, right? Like, you're doing a calculation behind the scenes. It's got to be right. And so I even had to break down for myself just how far wrong it was. And so I went ahead and I created a mock student that had, a traditional system. They had some performances, some different chapters in a course, some assignments, quizzes, and tests, that sort of thing. And a few years ago, I was on our school division's Power School leadership team when we started to bring in that LMS. And I got to see some of how different teachers set up their grade books. And I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I started to go through all the different permutations that I'd seen. One teacher enters just total points. Another teacher goes ahead and does weighted averages. Another teacher does weighted averages by chapter. One does weighted averages by event. One does, and so on. And I realized that for a student, I could go ahead and create almost a 30-point spread, not based on how the student performed, but only on how the teacher entered the grade. And so I could have that student go from a 45 and fail the class to a 75 and almost be on a roll just based on how the teacher punched the numbers into their grade book and nothing else.
Wow.
Wow, that seems like if we were trying to draw an illustration of the opposite of holistic assessment, that would just be really not seeing the picture of the student.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so then in your class, as far as the students are concerned, do they perceive that they are not writing any tests or doing any assessments all year? Is that their impression, and that they are building a body of work?
Yeah.
Or are you still doing little quizzes and week to week sort of typical quote unquote assessments, but they're going into the portfolio and they're seen as part of a larger picture? And like you said, you're only actually pulling the grades twice a year so the students don't feel. So are you still doing little quizzes and things like that, or is it all kind of alternative?
There's a huge piece with the language I found. And so, as a teacher, I think if anyone looks at my practice, they'll say, okay, well, you're still doing weekly quizzes, right? And I have every week there's a written piece. Students come in. I tell them not to study for it because I want to see where they're authentically at. And so we talk about, okay, well, let's have it open book so you have access to your resources, but let's also go ahead and make it something that you've never seen before. And that's just the expectation. Teaching math for so many years, I can't tell you the number of times that if you put anything even remotely different on a math test or a math quiz from what they've seen in their workbooks, and all of a sudden you've got 25 voices screaming at you how unfair this is. And here, I go ahead and I challenge students to think more deeply about things, but I never give them anything that they've seen outright. So it's about using the tools and resources that they have access to. So we do a weekly assessment, I call it. There's no grade on it. There's only feedback. There's a rubric on the back that is just the center column is criteria. And then there's a column for what it looks like to master that criteria or that problem solving piece. Usually it tends to be fairly minor things on the surface, but it's stuff that you can't fake when you're answering questions, right? So you have to understand it to be able to explain it. Otherwise, it's just glaringly obvious that the student isn't there yet. And then the third column on the far left is just for common things to work on from one week to the next. And I have students do a self-assessment piece, what I've called a skills tracking form, where they look each week and they say, okay, well, here's one thing I did well. Here's one thing I want to work on for next week. And then, of course, like being physics, we have labs quite regularly as well. So I get students to build a lab journal. I never tell them what to write. I try to get them to think through what would be important and think through that process. And, again, I tell them, okay, well, the first time you do a lab journal, should it be any good? Well, probably not, because you don't necessarily know what to put down, right? Or what's going to be important in the long run. So I even want them to think through that process. But I also open up their portfolios to include anything that they want, anything that they're passionate about. If a topic strikes them and they love it, go ahead and do something on it and include that as part of your portfolio. There's different ways to communicate your understanding and your learning to me. It doesn't have to be just through these. If students are going to take university physics at some point, I do want them to be able to do some aspect of paper and pencil tasks and think through and figure out how to visualize those things. But I don't want that to be the only piece of it either. I went too many years doing that and realized that it doesn't always get them what they need. And so, I also don't do things like homework anymore. I know lots of physics teachers who like to do those 30 questions a night of drill and kill practice. And, to me, that serves more to make students hate physics rather than learn to love it. I think if you look more deeply at just a handful of questions, you can get a lot better experience and a lot better understanding if you just focus on on that depth piece. So I have them come at individual questions that are more involved, but from about 5 or 6 different angles, sort of thing. So there are elements that are common, but usually at least the language has changed around them. So
I'm really glad that you brought that up, the drill and kill piece, but also this notion that the primary purpose that high school teachers serve is to prepare students for the real world, which can be confused with post-secondary education. And this is something that in my time as a consultant was very frustrating to hear. And sometimes I hear from teacher candidates who think that is the purpose. And so um, I kind of have two questions then based on some things you just shared. The first one then is, um, do you believe then that, could you talk a little bit more about how this approach you believe still helps prepare students for the university settings if they were to pursue that, knowing that many first and second year university courses still will use exams, which will involve maybe 50 plus multiple choice questions? And then maybe talk a little bit about the power of your feedback based approach without grades.
yeah. So couple years into doing all this, I was starting to see a lot of success with my students. I was starting to see a lot more growth. Um, and their interviews were getting to be more powerful. I had students that had fairly significant anxiety issues who were going ahead and telling me that by the end of the course, they didn't feel that in physics anymore, which is almost counterintuitive to a lot of people because usually physics is one of the worst for that sort of thing. Um, so I started to see a lot healthier environment, a lot healthier classroom. But for a lot of outside observers, like other teachers and things like that, a lot of people would say, "Oh, well, it's just you've got the physics kids," or "Oh, of course it works for you there, right?" They didn't realize that my demographic in my classroom was changing quite drastically. When I first took over the program, physics had a reputation that it was just for the so-called uh, creme de la creme in the building. Only the kids that could handle it, sort of thing. But to me, it was never supposed to be about that. I mean, to me, physics is for everyone. If you take a physics course, then I think life should be a little bit better for it, rather than only taking it because you need it. I think the world is a little more beautiful when you look up at the night sky and understand what goes on in the stars, or you understand the different properties of nature that help make everything as beautiful as it is. Um, and so I wanted students to feel that they had a safe place to explore those ideas. And so I didn't want it to look like it typically did. And so my demographic was changing. I think within 5 years of teaching physics this way, I've tripled the numbers of students that are in the physics program. I'm fortunate because I'm the only physics teacher, so I felt like I had the opportunity to explore all this. Mostly because I didn't have a physics teaching partner to go ahead and answer to, I guess. um, but I started to hear all this stuff that other teachers were saying, and I started to think to myself, okay, like, am I really doing right by my kids? Am I setting them up to fail later on down the road? And I started to worry about that a bit, and so I went ahead and I told kids the one year, I'm like, okay, we're going to try something different. We haven't done any final exams for a couple of years. I know that I know the physics departments at the local universities. I know that exams are going to be part of that. Let's just see how it goes. I'm going to pull out my old physics exam from before I started doing all this, and let's just see what happens. If it's reasonably close, then we're going to count it as a standard 20% final exam. If it turns out to be a train wreck, that's on me. It's not going to hurt anyone. And I made sure that they were aware of that. And so, we did this gradeless model with these portfolios for the whole course. And then traditional final exam, I had 25 multiple choice. I had a bunch of short answer. I had a few long answer. There wasn't one point in the course where I taught students how to do a physics multiple choice question. There wasn't one point in the course where I taught students to that exam in any way, shape, or form. And despite having, COVID in between, despite having a completely different model, despite not having grades, not having tests, not having homework, um, and having a much, much wider demographic of kids in my classroom, the program started to get more popular. I started to get students from, um, trades maths rather than just pre-calculus. I started to go ahead and get, half the football team and half the hockey team were interested in taking physics. You know, Kids who were just interested and just heard from a friend that they had a lot of fun in my class. Were giving it a shot. And so there's a million reasons why they shouldn't have performed as well, and instead they performed better on that final exam. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. It's like, okay, we don't have to do education the way that we've always been doing it. We can prepare kids in a different way and in a better way.
That's incredible. And so perfect that you just have that story ready where you can say, well, actually, I
Mm-hmm.
did give them a typical traditional exam. And despite the fact that we had not practiced, I know in Ontario EQAO, we have these standardized tests, and it's fairly common to just practice to the test all year at certain grades. And I think, that can be helpful in some ways. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. But amazing story that students could be learning in better ways and deeper ways, and that those skills just naturally develop because our learners are capable. And that's a very powerful story, I think, and proof of concept to some extent. Also, this is quite inspirational because I do believe many teacher candidates understand that the assessment system is not ideal, and they would be on board with what we're saying, but they just haven't seen that many actual models of it in practice. So there's a nervousness, and you're new and you have the curriculum, and you're like, well, twice a year, I do have to give them a grade. And so this is just such a cool example of, well, this person's actually doing it and at the intermediate senior level. I mean, primary junior could work really well as also, but so maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the criteria that you mentioned you co-create, and there are exemplars, and how are you actually doing that? How do you go about co-constructing the assessment criteria with your students? How do you move through that process?
So a lot of it comes into how I introduce things in grade 11 physics, which is their first physics course, right? So we start the first couple weeks looking at the nature of science and what it means to actually do science. And so we talk about, I give them these puzzle tasks, like here's an inquiry cube, make observations, figure out what goes on the final side. And we do a particle zoo card sort where I tell students, okay, you're all going to be particle physicists for the day. And, they get a bunch of different particle properties. Most of them are things that kids have never even heard of in grade 11, but they don't need to. They are making observations. They're looking for patterns. They're trying to make meaningful predictions, um, just like real scientists do. And so we do a number of these different activities, and then I say, okay, let's take this and let's start talking about science class. And what have your experiences been? What have been the good and the bad from previous science experiences? And the one funny thing is that for some reason, by the time kids get into grade 11, most of them really hate learning about clouds in grade 10 science. I don't know why the hatred for clouds, but they really don't seem to like them at that point. Um, but they talk about things like they love doing hands-on. They want to do more activities. They want to learn together, not in competition with each other. And they realize that that's how scientists actually do it. I'm wearing one of my shirts here from CERN. I went there a few years ago for their international high school teacher program, and I got to speak to 45 other teachers from around the world and learn about how things work there. And Atlas is one of their experiments that looks at the Large Hadron Collider, and there's a collaboration of 4,000 scientists working together on that one project. And they have to figure out how to work together to make these groundbreaking discoveries. And science isn't this independent venture. It's about curiosity. It's about passion. It's about being creative to figure out how to explain these concepts. Because it's not stuff that's just staring you in the face. There's an incredible level of interpretation that has to come into play to make sense of the world. And so we talk about what that looks like, and then we talk about, okay, well, what's it look like in the K-12 system? You guys are the learners. What's been your experience for all these years? I've been on the other side for too long. Is that what you experience? And inevitably, the students all say no. We're taught to go ahead and memorize stuff for a test, and that's the game we play. And usually I get a few of the higher achieving students will go ahead and I'll ask a question like, okay, well, where does your grade come from? And they say, well, mostly tests. And I'll say, okay, well, how do you get ready for those? And they'll always say, well, you study hard. Okay, well, what's that mean? Okay, well, you go home and you read over your notes and you do a few more practice questions. Okay, do you do that, staggered out, or do you do that all the night before? Well, most of them do it the night before. Okay, so then what happens when you walk into the test the next day? Oh, well, hopefully you remember a good part of it, right? I'll ask the class, and some of the kids who are maybe not as high achieving will say, well, I'm happy if I remember half of what I went over, and hopefully more than that is what's actually on the test. And the higher achieving kids will talk about remembering 90-95% of it or all of it, right? And then I'll say, okay, so all right, so you do this whole process. It helps you to memorize what's going on. Great, you do well on the test. What if I gave you the exact same test a week later? How would you do? And everyone just says, oh yeah, it would go awful. Okay, so then what did you actually learn through that whole process? Oh, we see where you're going there. And kids will go ahead and tell me, okay, well, we spent 11 years learning how to take a test. We're not actually walking away from any of our courses with anything other than how to take a test. And so that becomes this baseline of, okay, well, what should we promote? Well, scientists are curious, scientists are passionate, scientists are creative. So how do we make our course reflect that? And so when we're starting to develop like these criteria, we start looking at things like, okay, well, what should a passing portfolio look like? Okay, well, personally, I don't know a teacher in our building or in many buildings that if they see the student trying and putting in a legitimate effort with everything that they do, I don't know a teacher that isn't going to try and find a way to help them get to the credit. Maybe it won't look pretty, but at least they'll get them to the credit. If they're in it, they're sticking with it the whole time. If there's that perseverance is going through, right? So I said, okay, let's just call a spade, and let's just put that as our criteria for passing the class. You're putting in the effort. It's obvious. You can talk to me about it. You can hold that conversation. Okay, let's just put that out there. Okay, what's it look like for the next stage? What's a 60 to a 70 look like? What's a 70 to an 80 look like? And so students will start looking at, okay, well, what should evolve in that portfolio? Well, your lab journals should get a little bit better because you should start to learn what to recognize, what to look for. So even though the topics change, if your focus is on that problem solving piece, you should still see an evolution in how that looks, right? So each topic effectively becomes a reassessment for each previous topic, even though the topics are continuously changing throughout the course, because we're focused on that problem solving piece. And so that creates this spiraling of problem solving skills and critical thinking skills. what should happen on those weekly assessments? Well, again, if we start off with a problem solving process that begins with simply creating a visual and making sense of where the numbers in the problem belong and how they factor into the whole scenario. So, all right, let's start with a visual representation. Okay, well, you should see that slowly improve and slowly learn how to interpret the information that's in there and how to create something more meaningful. And so that should scaffold as well. Students talk about, okay, well, what about doing all the practice questions? And okay, well, that's a good thing, but okay, should that factor into the grade, or is that one of those pieces that helps give you guidance on how to get to the next rung on the ladder, right? And so we start to separate those formative pieces from those summative pieces, and students start to develop a roadmap of how to climb this scale and get to whatever grade they want to be at. And so they also learn too that without the averaging piece, it's a fresh conversation at midterm and at final. Midterm is just a where are you at today? And okay, if you're at a 60 today, all right, let's make a game plan during that interview. How do we get you to where you want to be? And so we make a meaningful plan and talk through, okay, well, which pieces have gotten you hung up on your learning? How do we rectify those issues over the coming weeks so that when we have our final interview in the course, okay, you're ready to tell me an 80 or a 90, and your portfolio absolutely supports that. So it's very much a collaborative endeavor that looks at the whole picture, the whole student.
So just to clarify then, I think I know the answer to this question, but just for the listeners, it sounds like you're not relying on averaging. So, for example, if a student comes in and they are, quote, terrible at physics, because they should be, because they just started. So, of course, they don't know how to do a lab. They're just getting in there. But by the time you get to the middle of the term or the reporting period, they have achieved that 70 to 80 rung or 60 to 70. You're going to put them at that rung. You're not averaging their early work.
No, so I mean, it's if they've seen some growth over those first few weeks. I mean, if we were to do a portfolio interview early on, and they were at, say, a 40, because it was just, whoa, physics is coming at me out of nowhere. If by midterm they're at a 60, then a 60 is what goes into the report card. If at the end of the course they're at an 80, then an 80 is what goes into the report card. The earlier pieces don't have any lasting damage, so to speak.
So, in addition to some of the insights that you've already shared with us, what are some of the most memorable ones that students have shared with you during your portfolio conferences that have perhaps influenced the progression or evolution of this approach?
You know what? There's been a lot of comments over the years from students. I'm very, very thankful that almost every comment has been a positive one. And I've gotten a lot of support from parents who've often said, it's about time school looked like this. Or, I never thought my child would be this excited about physics class. There's some stuff like that that's really surprised me over the years, that's been almost like a vindication, so to speak. But some of the most powerful things are, I've had a student who goes ahead and, well, one of the most typical comments I get is, wow, like I've actually learned something in this course. I'm walking out of the course during final interview, and we're doing this some review for the final exam that's just got a little bit of everything in it. And students are regularly telling me, well, I don't actually have to go back in my notes, it's all just right there in my brain. I don't have to refresh myself. There's none of this cramming or things like that. With this sort of system too, it also eliminates the need for cheating. A lot of students go ahead and tell me at the very beginning of the course, when we're doing those intro activities, they openly say, okay, well, I ask them, going back to like that testing piece, is Okay, well, if you didn't learn anything from the test, well, what else might you be tempted to do? And a lot of students will say, well, you're tempted to cheat, because if you look at the grade as holding your entire future, well, you feel like your back is against the wall. And so, yeah, I ask kids, okay, well, how many of you have cheated before at some point in school? And almost everyone puts their hand up every time. And, they'll even tell me some of the creative ways that they've done it. um, and it always comes back to this worry, this fear, this anxiety around my future hinges on getting a 90 in physics. Otherwise, I won't get that scholarship and I can't afford to go otherwise, um, or things like that. And with a system like this where students know that they can grow, I mean, it eliminates that imperative to cheat. There's no benefit to it anymore because it's not actually going to result in their learning. Also too, with looking at deeper questions that are more involved, it also becomes glaringly obvious if they do attempt. So it's something that it's eliminated those pieces. But I find a lot of students will go ahead and talk about how they have so much anxiety throughout the rest of school. And somehow my physics classroom has become their safe space for so many kids. And through that, I've built such amazing relationships with those kids that, um, I've had students that go ahead and have such severe anxiety issues that they have IEPs to go ahead and give teachers guidance on what to do with them and how to help them manage. And I don't usually need those. The students that are coming through my classroom, they usually are good. If you're not putting a grade on every single thing, guess what? They can kind of calm it down a little bit, and then they start to realize, okay, no, I've got another chance. I've got another chance. I can do this. And they start to get, instead of a negative feedback loop in their heads, they start to build a positive one. And sometimes for some kids, it's the first time in years that they've had that. And so it's such a powerful thing to see. I've had students with severe ADHD issues. I had one student who went ahead and I mean, part of this is I've also done some thinking classroom pieces where we look at collaborative activities. The funny thing is I first started doing that when I was teaching both some math and some physics. And with math, I did thinking classrooms with standards-based grading, has Liliadol prescribes in his book. But in physics, I did thinking classrooms with this gradeless model. And it was like night and day. In math, when the assessment piece is still revolved around those outcomes and around that grade piece and everything is marked, even though there are these reassessment opportunities, students are still focused on, oh, okay, well, how do I get my grade up? They're not focused on the learning, they're focused on the number. I still get, students who are resistant to do collaboration because, okay, well, what's it say about me if I'm partnered up with the kid who struggles? Does the teacher think that I'm struggling too? Does the teacher think that I'm strong and need to help them out? Right, all these different pieces start to go into it, and you don't get as smooth or as meaningful collaboration in that environment. But in my physics classes with this gradeless model, everyone just started to network and build connections with each other, and it started to just really flow. And it's funny because by the time they've finished grade 11 and they go into grade 12 with me, our first few activities of the year, kids will be getting back into the swing of things and stuff like that, and they'll say, they'll be working on a problem at the boards, and I'll say, okay, are you guys ready for a hint yet? And usually I'll get a, Mr. S, can you please just back off? We're going to figure this out. Just give us some more time and please stay out of it. And so usually in grade 12, the kids are supporting each other, and there's such a level of peer support that it's like one big giant family in the room. And they work together, and it's this wonderful thing because, I've got kids who their anxiety issues are basically, their IEP will say, well, don't put this kid at the front, and they'll actually volunteer to present. I'll have, like I said, a kid with extreme ADHD. Um, by doing this and them supporting each other, it frees me up to work with the kids who need it the most. And so I was able to sit down with this one kid and talk to him about where he's at and come up with some different strategies. And he looked at me and said, "Thank you, Mr. S. Nobody's ever actually helped me figure out how I learn best with my brain." And he says, I've gone 12 years through school and nobody's ever sat down with me to do that before. And now I feel I have a strategy that works. And so he went ahead and he ended up being really successful through the rest of the course. Um, he went ahead and later on down the road, he decided that he wasn't feeling good because of his medication, so he came off of it and went ahead and told him and was having some struggles again. So we sat down again, came up with new strategies, and he's like, "Thank you so much. Like I feel like I can go through without being punished for this. I feel like I can feel good about my brain and figure out ways to solve problems." And so while I'm seeing more success from students that would normally achieve well, like we started off, our school brought in an AP physics program based on demand. Students actually filled out a petition to get it offered. And I mean, that's the worst of the worst standardized exams in the world is the AP physics. Um, and I had a gradeless model in that classroom too. I didn't change things just because it was AP. And guess what? Like we went ahead and we went up against the AP exam this year, and our results were in line with the international averages. So students didn't suffer just because I took a different route. They performed just as well. And I had students in there that had those anxiety issues. I had students in there who, didn't have the strongest academic backgrounds, but they wanted to do AP to challenge themselves. And for some of them, just simply writing that 3.5 hour exam was a victory in itself. And they did it, and they're proud of it.
I have to just jump in and say that as someone who took the AP physics exam in grade 12, folks, it is no joke. It is no joke. Sitting there for the whole day, it's an endurance test. You see questions you have not seen before. They're really pushing you. So if we are to put this up against any standard, just knowing that it worked is incredible. So, Mr. Sarkonik, what advice would you give to teachers who are curious about trying a gradeless and or portfolio-based model, but unsure where to start?
Um, First, don't be afraid. Um, Second, I would say don't do half measures. I've seen a lot of people that try to do bits and pieces, and the problem is that then you get competing aspects in your assessment. So if you're marking this, but then telling kids marks don't matter, you're sending a very confusing message. Or if this is marked and there's no opportunity to come back at it, but this part can grow, there's no consistency there, and that tends to frustrate a lot of students in my experience. Um, from what I've seen, it frustrates the students, it frustrates the teachers. You have to be ready and to dive right in. The other thing is trust your students. They're the ones who are sitting in the learner seat, and they have been for years. They know what works for them. They know what doesn't work for them. They know how to game a system that they can game. They know what they want in their futures. As teachers, we're on the other side of things. Our nearest thing is often university educations that, university doesn't look like what high school should look like. High school shouldn't be university light and let's throw them into the thick of it. It should be more about let's figure out how to put scaffolds in place so that they're successful later on and in the long run. Um, so I mean, lean on students, get their opinions, get their input into what what your classroom should look like, and never be afraid of that. They have tremendously valuable insights, and I think at the end of the day, they want to learn. I think that's where we slowly see that level of engagement get kind of worn out of them throughout school years. Is, we see, there's research that came out not long ago that looks at, student levels of engagement, and it's super high in kindergarten. And you look at, there's other research looking at student levels of creativity, and again, super high in the early years, right? And as they progress through K to 12, it just goes way down. And I think that that's not their choosing. I think that's a major systemic issue that we need to work on, and figuring out, okay, there are different ways to do school. There's tremendous value in student agency, and we need to create systems that facilitate that.
Wonderful. So, while being an educator, you also wear the hat of a teacher researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and some of the research that you're currently doing in your classroom?
Yeah. So with all this, I ended up getting into contact with Dr. Ellen Watson at Brandon University, and she was interested in the same sort of things. And so we started to do action research together, which, prior to meeting her, I'd never even heard of. And honestly, I think it's some of the best teacher PD that I've ever done in my career, because it's authentic. It's right in my classroom. It's genuine. It's figuring out solutions to these problems, and trying different things, and seeing what works and what doesn't. And then sharing those results so that other teachers and other students elsewhere might go ahead and get some benefit from that. So we went ahead and we started off, we gathered data from, I think we had 24 or 26 students, went ahead and signed the consent form to let us use some of their information. And so we have self-assessment data, portfolio conference data, things like that. And from that, our first paper will be coming out hopefully this fall, I think. It's been accepted by the Alberta Science Education Journal, looking at how the effects of a gradeless high school physics classroom affect student self-determination. And there was tremendously positive results from that. Um, the autonomy and competence pieces certainly seem to be coming from what we were doing with the gradeless classroom. The collaborative piece of that puzzle seemed to more so come from the thinking classrooms aspects, and creating an environment that really focused on collaboration, and this wonderfully positive environment where students support each other. So that'll be our first paper that should be published shortly. We're looking at getting things together for our next publication, and yeah, kind of hoping that we'll get a few different perspectives to look at this data through. So yeah.
That's awesome. Just for our listeners, would you mind telling us what you mean when you say self determination and why that might be of interest to some of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So a number of years back, Desi and Ryan went ahead and came up with self-determination theory, which focuses on a person's autonomy, competence, and collaborative or sense of belonging, I guess it is. And so, if somebody has those three pieces in their life, they're gonna feel like they have that level of self-determination, more like they have control over their life, more that um, they feel more fulfilled, right? Um, and so I think that that research kind of resonated with me. And I mean, if you think about it, it seems kind of natural. If you feel like you're part of something bigger, and you have an important role to play in it, but you also have the autonomy to figure out what works best for you. um, I think it creates this wonderful balance between things. If you take away any of those pieces, then I think that's where people tend to get disengaged with education, or with their jobs, or things of that nature. So
Awesome. Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, Chris. This has been such an informative session. I just really appreciate your time and the work that you do. And we have just a couple quick rapid fire questions, kind of for fun, just for those little soundbitey, 30 seconds or less snippets.
Yeah.
And so the first one is, it's a big question, but we'll try to just do it as a little bite-sized piece. What gives you hope right now in education in the world?
I'm optimistic because I see educators wanting to make change. I just came back from the Canadian Assessment for Learning Network conference here in Winnipeg. Was this past week, and got to speak to educators from around the country, and they are wanting to go ahead and figure out how to do different things in their classrooms that benefit their students. And I've been to these big international physics PDs at CERN, at Perimeter Institute, at LIGO, and talked to educators from all over the world, and they're wanting to make change. And I feel like we're getting to this tipping point where that desire to make change and to better the education system is on the verge of making this huge systemic change, almost like this paradigm shift, so to speak, right? Where you see this jump in where people's thinking is.
Love those paradigm shifts. Thank you. And secondly, and finally, can you please give us 2 recommendations? So this is super broad, could be resources, books, articles, TV shows, podcasts, recipes, anything else you're into right now.
Okay. Well, I've been going ahead and I just started my PhD program at University of Manitoba. And so I've been getting up at 5 a.m., driving to U of M and taking class, and then driving back home to Brandon again. And so with a lot of time on the road, I've been just devouring podcasts. And so like I love the work that both of you have done. And so I've really enjoyed those. A couple of other ones that I've really enjoyed listening to. There is the Self-Driven Child podcast from Ned Johnson. That one's been fantastic. I just listened to an episode where they interviewed Mike Nicholson, who runs this wonderful organization out of the States called Learning Inspired. I got to meet him, and he invited me down to Ohio in March to speak at the Student Power Summit, which is such an incredible opportunity. And then let's see, there's also the Grading podcast has been really great to listen to. And from some Canadians out of Vancouver, Natalie Vardabasso and Tom Schimmer have their Assess That podcast. I've been catching up on that one as well. And I also have really loved a lot of stuff from Human Restoration Project too. So sorry,
Wonderful.
I think it's more than 2.
I'm just writing these down. Human Restoration Podcast?
Yep.
Is that what you said? Awesome.
Yeah, Human Restoration Project.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Chris. That was so inspiring. I guess, well, a question I kind of wanted to ask was, so I had a conversation with Ellen this summer, and
yes.
That's how we've connected. And I'm really interested in her work on nature of science, philosophy of science, and history of science, and thinking a lot about how I can really embed those throughout my, I teach pre-service science teachers. And so thinking about how I can embed those throughout my course and not as a one-off. But if you also, I'm also just really excited about your model and really excited. I kind of want to edit this episode immediately so I can bring it into my class during the first week of school. But if you were designing a course for pre-service science teachers or just pre-service teachers in general, because I think we were excited about interviewing you about physics because I think physics is commonly known as a really dense topic that requires perhaps memorization, and you've now debunked that for us. So I like physics as an example that you can literally do this with any course. So if you were designing your own course for pre-service teachers, what would you tell them? How should I approach how should I teach my course this year?
um, oh boy. I'm just trying to think here.
Sorry, it's a big one. I'm just now picking your brain.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like I mean, a lot of it is trying to get them to think back to what it was like not to take their university science courses or whatever discipline, but to think more about um what they enjoyed from those pieces when they got to focus to that level, right? Because those university courses, they get deeper and deeper and deeper, and I think if we're honest, like not a lot of uh, um university physics profs are maybe the best versed in, say, pedagogical approaches or assessment approaches, right? Their background is deep understanding of their subject area, but it does open a door where you get to learn that almost none of them are doing it alone. You can see that passion from a lot of them, that excitement for what they do, especially if you sit down and talk with them. um and so looking at how to instill that in our students. And so, like, with nature of science, like getting them to think, find reasonably authentic tasks, or I guess like the inquiry cube is still somewhat contrived, but like it gets them thinking in those ways. It gets them thinking in that problem solving way, and trying to explain nature and what you see around you is really this big giant puzzle that I tell my students, it's you're trying to go ahead and figure out, the thing about science is you're trying to figure out the truth, right? Whatever the truth is, but we never actually reach it. We get better and better approximations to it, and we keep creating better and better models that explain a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. It doesn't mean that those old models that have gone before are garbage and should be thrown away. um we still sent the Voyager spacecraft into outer space using Newtonian physics. We had Einsteinian physics at the time. We didn't need it. It was overkill for what we were trying to do. So we had a better model and still use the old one anyway. And now, like, I mean, we go ahead and we look at like quantum physics, and we use quantum physics to go ahead and give us our cell phones. There's different aspects that are governed by quantum in there. So we have to have this deep understanding of it. At the same time, our GPS doesn't function right without our understanding of Einsteinian physics, and relativity. But if you put those two pieces together, all of a sudden it blows up and you get a whole bunch of infinities that make no sense in the real world. So we know something's still wrong, even though they're both remarkable models that get us, from what we can tell, very, very close to an understanding of what's going on in reality. So it's developing an appreciation, I think, for science isn't about actually finding the truth. It's about the journey to get there. And that the developments that you make aren't meant to be thrown away. They have different applications in different areas. And so understanding things from different points of view can lead to these wonderful insights. Um, so I think it's getting people to open up from that science is all about right and wrong to it's more about this journey, and finding that, rediscovering that beauty for it. Because I think science often isn't given nearly enough credit for being this aesthetically beautiful and creative thing that it actually is. So yeah, and that's where I've used like a lot of Perimeter Institute has a nature of science resources, and so I've used a lot of pieces from it to try and help build that with my students. And I think that this model of assessment reflects that science is this iterative process, and that we shouldn't discount the journey. And it's okay to look at where we're at today. And so I see assessment has being a reflection of that. And so I think that's part of why what I've been doing is successful.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, I feel like we're over time. So
That means it was a good one.
That was a
Sorta.
good one. That was a gooder. 100%. Yeah, thank you again.
Yes,
And
thank you.
I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer in beautiful Brandon.
Yeah,
You've
it's
given us things to think about. Just like Anne was saying, I'm like, oh, what can I incorporate? How can I incorporate some of these ideas into my teaching immediately?
yeah.
But like it's perhaps slightly it's too late. Like the syllabi are in. But moving forward.
Never say
Yeah,
never, Lauren.
Never say never. Never say
yeah,
never. At least to teach about assessment for sure.
yes.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much.
We would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on Mississauga, Mississauga territory, treaty and traditional, at Trent University in Peterborough, Nogojoanong, Ontario, Canada. We are grateful to the First Nations of this territory for their teachings about and care for the land on which we teach and learn. The podcast was made possible by a Trent University Knowledge Mobilization Grant and is skillfully edited and produced by our friend James Bailey.